Good morning. Sorry for the delay and the pictures of my kids. Some technical issues this morning. Thank you for coming to the MOC Distinguished Scholar Address and Scholarly Awards session this morning. I'm pleased to see such a nice showing. My name is Kevin Rockman. I'm the chair, the program chair for the MOC division this year, and I'm joined by several members of the MOC Executive Committee. It's my pleasure this morning, in addition to doing the awards, which we'll do after the talk, is to introduce Dr. Sitkin. And I have to go back here because I assumed we had a little podium out front. So just some of the details. If you don't know Sim is a professor of management and founding faculty director of the Fuqua Coach K Center on Leadership and Ethics at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke. He's a fellow of the Academy of Management since 2010 and a fellow for the Society of Organizational Behavior. His research, as if you don't know already, is focused on formal and informal organizational control systems and leadership and risk-taking, accountability, trust, learning, and all sorts of other organizational processes and innovation. His research has appeared, well, everywhere. His most recent book is Organizational Control, which was published in 2010. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you can still get that. Free 2-day shipping, so please sign up. Reasonable price. He is one of only 2 individuals to have won Best Paper Awards from the Academy of Management Review. And of course, we are most grateful for his service to the MOC division. He was actually on the division chair track when it was 5 years from 1994 to 1999. How were those years? Great years. Personally, I'd like to say one of the, even though I did not know it at the time, Sim was an influence to me because when I was an undergraduate student at Illinois, one of the first cases I did was Carter racing, like I'm sure a lot of people have done. And Sim took a lead on writing that case, and now it's a case that I use in all my organizational behavior classes, and my students are very grateful that you did that work, and I am as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Sim. Please help me welcome him.
Thank you. I was reminded when I was informed of this, in a very nice phone call from Elizabeth George, that of my good friend Terry Mitchell, when he won a similar kind of award from the OB division, that his immediate reaction was, no, I'm not dead yet. And so one of the things I decided that I wanted to do in putting together these remarks, there are a variety of ways you can approach this. And one of the ways is to talk about the work you've done in the past. And I think that's appropriate if you're dead yet. But what I wanted to focus on is looking forward. What are the things that I think are the opportunities and threats in the world we live in that are relevant to the research that we might want to do? And what are the things that are opportunities and threats for our profession? So to really talk about this dual notion of the research and the profession. And originally I was my notion was to start with the threats and then end on an up note, but I was having a drink with Robin Ely the other night, and she said, no, don't start with a downer. Start with the positive side. So I'm going to start with the opportunities. And I think there are a number of opportunities. And the other thing I would like to do is to not have this just be a talk at you, but if you have reactions, even along the way, but certainly at the end, I'm not sure that the stuff that I'm saying is going to be uncontroversial. So I do want people to feel like they can engage in, no, I think that's a really dumb idea, or I don't see it quite that way, and that's fine. So the first thing I think is an important trend is there is a real disillusionment in societal institutions that you see in a number of parts of the world. I mean, you certainly see this in the United States, but you see it more broadly. The reduction in trust in our key institutions. whether it's government institutions, whether it's financial institutions. People are now thinking about this in terms of healthcare institutions. I mean, you go down the list, that the erosion of trust, and I would go so far as to say it's not just an erosion of trust, we've actually moved into the domain of distrust, where the underlying factor here is that people really don't believe that the institutions that we've created for our societies actually share our values. That they're working for their own benefit rather than for the reason they were created in society. That's not a reason for optimism for us as members of society, but for us as organizational scholars, it is a tremendous opportunity, because it means that many of the things we do and the insights that we can provide are incredibly relevant right now. That a lot of this is not well understood. I remember a couple of years ago talking with a Duke grad who is the CEO of a big financial institution about some of the research on trust and distrust, and this was right after the big eruption of financial institution crises in the United States. And I was explaining some of the implications, and that I thought everybody on the government side and everybody on the financial institution side was actually doing all the wrong things. And I explained why from the research I thought that was the case. And his response was, how come nobody's telling us that stuff? We could have done that, it's just we didn't know. So what that says to me is our research actually is not only relevant to, but is vital to addressing this kind of issue. Another aspect of this is that part of the, I think, suspicion about our institutions is a lack of understanding that control can actually be enabling, not just coercive, to coin the phrase that's in our literature. And the notion of understanding what makes control systems enabling is lacking from the debate. And again, that's another thing that we can really contribute to this disillusionment. And then finally, in terms of some of my current work on leadership, the notion of what we call contextual leadership, which is really just sense-making. The role of leaders in helping those that are following them make sense of a complex, changing kind of world, I think is often really lacking. You know, when someone as articulate as Barack Obama has to have a former president, Bill Clinton, be referred to as the explainer-in-chief. And Obama is actually pretty good at explaining a lot of these things. It's just Clinton is better at it. But if you look around at a lot of the leaders, regardless of what sector they're from, they are not helping people understand the situation. And I think that's a key part of the disillusionment as well. And so the whole body of work on sense-making issues, I think, is incredibly relevant, not only to us, and in MOC especially, but also to real issues in the world, which means not only can we help them, but they're providing us with great field research opportunities for really better understanding some of this. The second thing that I view as an opportunity, I know a lot of my colleagues view this as a threat, is I actually see the advances in terms of the whole brain science, neuropsychology, all of that, as an incredible opportunity for our field. And just to give you one example from my own work that we've come across is when you look at debates in the field about is there really a distinction between trust and distrust, and people have good reasons for not really, for thinking there is a distinction, which I do, or not thinking it. If you look at some of this neuropsych work, it actually suggests that what we measure as trust and what we measure as distrust activates different parts of the brain. That suggests that we can actually leverage the advances in our ability to look at brain functioning as another way of testing some of our constructs, as another way of seeing, are we creating false distinctions in some cases, because we've given it a different label, but it actually seems to function exactly the same way in the brain. Or when we have these debates, does there seem to be some physiological evidence that supports one side or the other? I also think there are some very encouraging although potentially traumatic in the short term, moves, directions, activities in terms of, I didn't know what to call it, but social science administration. So for example, there are a number of things like this first one, the creation of data archives and pre-research submissions. You're seeing in certain journals, in certain fields, the requirement that before an article will even be reviewed, the data set has to be loaded into an archive and be accessible. So reviewers can go double check things. Certainly if an article is published, the data set should be available for others to double check the work. Now, this is partly a response to some of the controversies that have arisen, but one of the things I think that is nice about this approach is rather than viewing it as punitive, it's in a sense preventative. Because it's saying to people, you may not want to cheat on this because everybody's going to be able to double check. And it's going to really reduce the temptation to engage in that kind of negative behavior. The other advantage is, for any of you who've tried to do a meta-analysis, sometimes you just can't get the data you need to do a good meta-analysis. Any of you who have tried to replicate other studies, I remember a number of years ago there was a paper by Solancic and Pfeffer where I actually had a different theory about what I thought their data would come out with, a different kind of analysis. And I contacted Jerry Solancic, and he had literally moved 2 weeks before and had thrown away the data that he had been keeping in his garage for 15 years. Now, if it were archived, and he would have been fine with me doing the reanalysis, he didn't care, but it couldn't be done because the data didn't exist anymore. So what we want to do is, especially when you're dealing with field data, when you're really dealing with very large data sets, and now there's some debate when you have really large complex data sets, how do you archive it? How do you help people know how to access it? It's not, there's some very significant technical problems with this. But this move, I think, is a very, very constructive move. And I think it's essential for our field to advance on something I'm going to talk about a little bit later in terms of what I see as a threat, is that to use a technical term, we really suck at cumulative replication research. So I sometimes like to be provocative, like when I'm talking to a junior faculty or a doctoral consortium, and say, as a field, we really don't know anything because we don't replicate. And you can cherry pick a lot of results. I mean, people will run multiple experiments until one of them works. People will run multiple analyses of their data sets until one of them works out cleanly. What we really want to be able to do is to show the replications, and you will have different findings across individual studies, but what you want to see is the pattern. Is the pattern really there? So I think this is very important if we want to encourage people to replicate, to be able to get access to those data sets. The other thing is, just the other day, just a few days ago, I was sitting in the Board of Governors meeting, and the different journal editors were all reporting on what was going on. And one of the things I found really encouraging was the AMP editors were talking about how they were encouraging all of us to start thinking about other indicators of impact. And I think that's a very promising kind of move. One that they were trying to now really create metrics for was, how do we measure impact on other disciplines? How do we actually try to systematically look at not only ideas that we're importing or citations within the discipline, but how much is what we're publishing actually being reflected in other disciplines, and are we capturing that and really weighting that? Another thing that came out of that same meeting was Jerry George from AMJ mentioned that AMJ has a new call for papers on what they're calling grand challenges. And I think this issue of one problem as fields advance is each piece becomes narrower and narrower and more specialized. And that's actually good because that gives us depth of knowledge on particular things, especially if we had replication. But the thing that you can lose from that, and if you look back through the history of the field, some of the most impactful and lastingly impactful articles and books are ones that had a broader view. What are those grand challenges, and are we missing the forest for the trees? Are we missing the important issues by focusing on these finer and finer details? It shouldn't be either or. We don't want to give up on the fine details, but we also don't want to lose sight of the bigger ones. And with respect to that, especially speaking to my senior colleagues in the audience, as you become more senior and more established, you have the luxury of looking at broader issues. You're not as worried about what's going to happen next year. And so I really think we need to have a mix of approaches in the field, and we don't have enough of people stepping back. And partly that's one of my agenda items, why I was willing to take on being editor of the Annals, is to try to encourage some of those looks that are broader. But within the Annals, we're actually trying to encourage some reviews that are a little narrower, some reviews that are much broader to get that kind of mix. This one, the next issue, context-specific research, I think is a little more controversial sometimes. But I think we have a real opportunity to ask the question, are the general principles that we think are general applicable equally across different contexts? My take actually is we do need context-specific research as well, because we can miss on some of the nuances of contingency variables, other mediating variables that don't show up equally in every context. So, for example, if you look at leadership in professional services, one thing some of us are looking at now is if you move from, say, leadership in a financial services institution to leadership when you're talking about a physician-patient relationship, are there factors in one of those environments that is not relevant in the other environment, or just gets weighted differently? And if we allow ourselves to say, how does it work in this environment, not simply test the general model, that one of the advantages of that is we may discover contingency factors that we would otherwise miss, because in general it does work in a general way. It's just in particular it doesn't work only that way. And we can develop much more robust models that are more precise in making predictions that are, and by the way, what that suggests is in some contexts that contingency variable would be weighted 0. And in other contexts that contingency variable might be really critical. But you never get that if you don't allow yourself to see how different contexts might vary substantially. The last thing that I find very encouraging is that, and this is related to a new venture that I've been involved with for the past couple of years, creating another association called Behavioral Science and Policy Association, and a journal where the first issue isn't out yet, but it's going to be coming out in early 2015. And the purpose of it is to take social science research, not just management or organizational science research, but social science research that is empirical, and translate it so practitioners in the public and private sector can actually use our findings. They lean on economics a lot. They don't lean on the rest of the social sciences nearly as much. It's not their fault, it's our fault, because we never translate it into a form that they can use. So as a result of doing that, I've discovered how much movement there is just in the past few years even, in terms of the social sciences being recognized as not being at the grown-ups table, and that there is real opportunity for impact. And a number of people, as I look around the room, some people have been doing this for many years, some people have been doing it more recently, but the idea of actually trying to get our work to be taken into account as critical decisions are made is being recognized more and more on both sides. So when I was putting together that new organization, our list of advisors and editors is like a who's who of the social sciences, many of whom were very honest and said 5 years ago they would have laughed at this and never been interested. But now they're angry that their work, they read the newspaper and say, if that person only knew about so-and-so's study or about my study, they wouldn't have made that stupid mistake. But they're totally ignorant of it. And people are starting to, the best scholars are starting to say, it's worth me taking a little time to figure out how to take my best empirical, and it's not just about cool ideas, it's about empirical findings, and make sure that people are using them. So you can see this coming up in a variety of ways. You're starting to see more social experiments. Businesses are more interested in doing experiments. Government organizations are more interested in doing experiments. The rise of evidence-based management, and you can see this in other fields, evidence-based medicine, and it's really kind of spreading. And government institutionalization. So the UK actually has taken the lead on this. And I don't know how many of you know the book Nudge by Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein, but Dick Thaler has been working with the UK government, the conservative UK government. In the UK, evidently, being conservative does not mean you don't value science. The conservative UK government has created something they call the Behavioral Insights Team. And when they're looking at new policies and regulation, they actually have a team of social scientists who ask the question, is this something we know about that could influence how that is being designed? And if we don't know, going back to this first point, can we design an experiment before we plunge in with both feet into this new policy? I can tell you it hasn't been announced in the US, but the US is now doing the same thing. So the Obama administration has created, I never remember the name of it, but it's something like the Behavioral Insights Team. And it's not placed within the White House so that it will have a staff that doesn't turn over when there is a political turnover in the White House. It's placed in the civil service part of the government, so it can really operate as a quasi-independent, and that's brand new. That's brand new. Now, this is an opportunity in part because who has played the lead in this? It's not the organizational scientists. It's the behavioral economists. It's the behavioral decision theorists. It is some of the social psychologists and cognitive psychologists, although less so. So there is a huge opportunity because the insights are tremendous coming from those groups, but even more and additional insights can be gained by broadening it out to more of the social sciences, including us. Now, how do I switch to the next slide? And that provides an opportunity to think about what are some of the threats. Let me see how I'm doing on time. So I really have two kinds of threat concerns. One is threats to our science, and the second is threats to us as a profession. So the first is this notion of construct proliferation. To get published in many of our top journals, you've got to create a new name for what your construct is. And maybe you vary an item or two to justify that, but it's really not that different from what already exists. So one of my pet peeves is if you look at a lot of our literatures, the same things are being labeled differently, and different things are being named the same. So if you actually go to the literature, this creates a really big problem in creating cumulative knowledge, in replicating, and a lot of times I've been stunned sometimes that literatures I thought were very precise, very careful, very rigorous about this. When you actually dig in and you want to build on one of those studies and you look at what the items actually are, many times they have nothing to do with what the construct is about. Or they may, even worse, is the item for an independent variable is actually just the dependent variable worded slightly differently. And then amazingly, isn't it surprising how high the relationship is between the independent and the dependent variable? I think we really need to clean this up. If you look at the second item, I think we have the same problem with imprecise modeling and the notion of mapping these constructs to the measures. And I think one of the things that I love about our field is that we're filled with really nice people. I really like the people in our field. The problem with that is sometimes we're too nice to each other. And we need to view calling each other out on these things not as a personal attack, but as a joint effort to try to move things forward. And I think we need to be nice about it. I think we need to be polite about it. I think we need to be respectful. But I think we're not going to make the progress we need to make unless we really take this critical eye to some of the things that we assume. Because otherwise, a lot of things that we really emphasize are meaningless. And so if any of you have seen a paper that Dan van Nippenburg and I had in the Annals a couple of years ago, where we took on transformational leadership literature. That was part of our motive, was to say you needed to have senior people with some standing in order to criticize and who had contributed in part to those literatures, be willing to go in and say, you know, maybe we have not been doing this really the right way and we need to rethink what we're doing. And I think there are a lot of areas of our field where it's not enough to just be critical. You want to be constructively critical. But I think we have to tackle these things rather than just let them sit. I mentioned lack of replication before. The one piece of this that I think is really a threat is that it's easy to say we should be replicating studies. There are absolutely no incentives, and in fact there are huge disincentives for people to do that. Our outlets do not support that. This is a real threat because for us to advance, you have to be able to see in different contexts, did it work the same? You have to be able to build that larger set of data. And right now, we as a field do not have the right infrastructure for that, either as a profession or in our individual institutions. And so to me, this is a real threat for which I'm not as optimistic, because I don't see a clear path out of it. But I do think it's a very serious threat. I also think that there is a legitimate fear of challenging the received wisdom, which is why the lead on this has to be taken by senior people, and especially senior people being willing to criticize their own work. So for example, I mentioned that I did that with respect to part of the leadership literature. I'm now doing some of that with respect to part of the trust literature, where I think some of the things that I argued in past papers may be wrong. And I remember getting some data back one day and walking around grumpy all day because I was thinking, you know, do I really want to put this forward and say this whole thing that I was pushing was wrong? And the answer is, of course. If that's what the data is telling us, we need to be willing to do that. And we can partner with junior people who have the great idea. But in many cases, it's too risky in our field right now for a junior person to take the lead on doing that. So they need to be given cover. The other thing I would say is that editors need to be more courageous in dealing with their reviewers in handling papers like that. So you don't want editors ignoring the reviewers. I mean, that's a very dangerous path to go down. But editors should have the courage, on occasion, to say the reviewers are basically an entrenched interest group, not because they're malevolent, but because they're a little myopic based on seeing the world a particular way. And that the editor really should be able to step back or select reviewers that can counterbalance that and provide that coverage for people who are taking those kinds of risks. But right now, that's not the structure we've got, and that's not the dominant mode of behaving. So it really is I think it is a threat if we can't do that. Because we've matured as a field enough that what we now need to do is to do some creative destruction as well as continuing to build. Concern about the profession. So this is more about infrastructure in a sense rather than research per se, although it's related. The first is, you know, a number of years ago I wrote a paper with Chip Heath on big O and big B. So was OB really about the O, or was it really about the B? And that the challenge to the field was to make what we do less simply a derivative of social psychology and more a distinct field by really leveraging that we are looking at organizations. And it's not that that's immune from what a lot of other fields do, but it blends certain insights that other fields tend not to focus on as much. There is a real danger that we're losing the O. The positive news is if you look around top business schools, there are more deans that come from OB than used to be the case. That's cause for some optimism. However, what worries me is in discussions over the past, I'd say 5 years or so, with colleagues at other top business schools, there are relatively few schools where people aren't expressing a worry that OB and management groups have relatively few people who are OB people or OT people and are studying organizations, as opposed to either being essentially psychologists who happen to be in a business school and are doing what they always would have done in a psych department, or are macro sociologists who were in a business school and are doing what they always would have done. And my alma mater is, I think, a classic example of both of these. So at Stanford, you have a micro group and you have a macro group within the OB group. They do not interact with each other very much. And people we might view as exemplars of the field as a whole, people like Jeff Pfeffer and Charles O'Reilly and Rod Kramer, are really in the middle. And they don't have a group, because most of the action and most of the younger scholars being hired are at those two extremes. So we're creating, in a sense, a bimodal field. And it hasn't happened as much yet, but bimodal distributions tend to lead to much more politicization of interaction. All you've got to do is look at the US Congress right now to see the dysfunctionality of a bimodal distribution, right? We don't want, as a field, to create that, and we're moving in that direction in the top schools, where it's much easier in many cases to hire someone from a psych department or a social department than it is from an OB group. It's not exclusively true, but it's a trend, and I'm hearing it more and more, and that's why it's a worry and it's a real threat. The second thing is, I used to joke, and this would annoy some of my friends and colleagues, that behavioral economics would be more accurately described as amateur cognitive psychology, where they only believed it if 20 years of research was ignored and they redid what the cognitive and social psychologists had already done. And they didn't do it as well, but they now valued it because they did it. I have changed my mind. Now, this is partly due to this behavioral science and policy work that I'm doing, that I started looking at the research in a slightly different way, is that I am seeing more and more examples of, let me just use behavioral economics as an exemplar of this, of behavioral economists tackling problems that we should be tackling but haven't been tackling, and doing a better, more creative job about not only studying it empirically, but even theorizing about it than we are. So they have gone fairly quickly from, in my estimation, amateurs on our turf to actually doing some of these things better than we're doing it, because they have the courage to do it, because they're really being rigorous about sticking with tough problems, where if we can't figure out how to do it quickly, we don't do it. Doing it in a way that's more cumulative in some cases. So they haven't obviated our value by any means, but I think they have, in my estimation at least, gone from being a sort of peripheral threat to being actually a very fundamental threat to our value and identity. And we should use that as an excuse, because we actually have more tools in our toolkit. Our theories are more relevant, are more nuanced in many ways. Our empirical approaches are just as good, if not better than theirs in some cases. We're not deploying them. We're not tackling some of those tougher issues. I also worry in parallel with this, although this is less our problem than the problem more generally in the social sciences, is that, that cognitive psychology and cognitive approaches are really, I mean, I don't mean this as negatively as it sounds, but they're like a weed that has been growing and taking over the vegetation in an area. And you see that from field to field. You look at political science and it's happening there. You look at psychology and it's happening there. You look at a lot of our fields and it's happening as well. That the idea of really taking the social, the context into account in a way that's not just an error term, not just a control variable, that's not really the context, is I think a really dangerous trend. And so I think that loss of the social, it is to our benefit for social psych to become more social again, to be more prominent again. And so even though it's not necessarily our field, although for some of us that would be your identity, it really is very much in our interest to help boost the social and social psychology as well. Now, the last piece, which is similar to that, is if you look at sociology departments. I mean, I've complained sometimes to colleagues in sociology, how come when I turn to my colleagues, there are no organizational sociologists anymore that I can go consult with, collaborate with in the social department, and they throw it right back and say, the answer is all you business school people have stolen everybody. Anytime there's someone from a social department who has an interest in organizational issues, they get offered more money and a lighter teaching load in a business school. So they're out of the social departments. And so as a result, we know, just as it's harder for many of us to collaborate with people in our psych departments because there isn't as much of that link as it becomes more cognitive, let's say, there isn't a link to the social department either, because every time there's someone we could link to, we appropriate them. And so I think it is in our interest, and that's why I've shifted some of my focus to the broader social sciences, not just to the management field or the organization science field, because I think it's the collection of the social sciences together that have to be stronger in the areas that are relevant to us in order for us to actually continue to have the strength we have. Now, this is happening in the face of the academy still growing like crazy. You look at the number of journals, the level of activity. The question now is, have we, sort of splayed too far out without having the strength of that root infrastructure, and can we now go back and do some infilling? Because I think these threats, both to the profession and to our science, are very real. One more example of both a plus and a minus is you're starting to see some foundations be very supportive of some of these opportunities. Like the Sloan Foundation has been funding many of these initiatives to try to create data archives and ways that journals can promote that. Now, on the negative, just last night, I was in a conversation and heard about a new paper that is being actually presented today, where an analysis was done looking at the degree to, this is a great idea, by the way, it's just the results are very upsetting, the degree to which the most cited AMR papers, the highest impact AMR papers, are actually being used accurately in the most cited AMJ, ASQ papers that are ostensibly using that AMR paper's theory. And the answer is stunning. So they actually tracked through. Did they really test the hypotheses that were proposed? Did they really test the model that was proposed? The answer was in 2% of the cases. Is that not stunning? It's not, 20% would be upsetting. 2% is shocking. And to me, there are several things. One is, it reinforces this idea, do we really know? Or are we spinning theory and not actually checking it out, number one. Number two, how is this getting through our empirical journals? When people are just asserting I'm testing so-and-so's theory, or I'm testing my own theory, and nobody actually says, that's actually not what they said. You may be testing something interesting, but you're not testing that theory. And then the last thing that really worries me about this, and it reinforces an issue that I raised earlier, is what I worry about is what's happening in the empirical papers is that basically what people are doing to get through the review process is cherry picking the best results, cherry picking the best variables. So they started out trying to test that theory. But when it didn't work out, it could be because they measured it badly, it could be because it was a bad study design, it could be because the theory didn't work. But then they just sort of picked and chose from among things until they found something that let them tell a good story. But it had nothing to do with what they were originally doing, which makes me really suspicious of whether those are results we should rely on. And these are highly cited papers that we as a field are relying on. I think that's a very dangerous and highly threatening prospect for both of these areas, both for the profession, but also for the degree to which our science is really a solid science. So let me stop there and then open it up. How much time do we have?
We've got 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, so let me open it up for comments or questions.